What is up, YouTube? We are back on our run to regionals, and I've had a lot of technical difficulties with my phone, and it's trying to die, and my phone is also my camera right now, unfortunately, as it has been for a little while. But we're going to try to make it through this as best we can. I'm going to skip some of the decks on our run that just didn't quite end up in the run for this, as it were. I'm pretty sure, truth be told, I've been doing a lot of playtesting, I'm pretty sure of what I'm going to play. But one of the decks that kind of got my attention that I really did want to consider is the Dark deck. And that's basically any deck that revolves around Yveltal EX, Darkrai EX, and Yveltal's other friend, himself, just regular old Yveltal. The deck is pretty, the ease of play, I mean, there are a number of variants of this deck, and they're all more or less easy to play in that they are not easy to play, but like their level of ease, or rather their level of difficulty, is roughly similar no matter which version you play. And I've tested a number of different versions of the deck, and they're all you can understand it, but you have to really think about all your plays is kind of the thing. You need to be very conscientious every turn. You need to keep your long-term goals in mind. You can't really afford to make many mistakes and still expect to win. So it is a challenging deck in that regard. As far as match length goes, it's pretty average. You can do okay. It can be one of the slower decks out there, especially if you play it slowly, so of course you have to be careful of that. And in terms of my familiarity with the deck, I'm not as familiar as I'd like to be, but I've played Dark, and in a lot of ways you don't have to be terribly familiar to understand where the deck is coming from. That said, as far as I'm concerned, playability on this deck for me is going to be 3 out of 5. So kind of average, not great, but not horrible either. The matchups, there are good matchups for this deck. The matchups that are best are actually just matchups in terms of, honestly, in terms of your skill level versus the other player's skill level, because this deck gives you a lot of options. So anybody who's not really prepared, you can do well against them. Anybody who's got a little bit slower setup, slower decks, you can often kind of run against them. And this deck can have good matches against any deck, presuming they don't get the fastest start. Now that said, your bad matchups are pretty glaring. A lot of the fighting decks, despite Yveltal's fighting resistance, actually can still have a pretty good time against you. Metacam, or Metacham, however you want to pronounce him, just ignores the resistance altogether, of course, and can wreck shop on you pretty quickly just by being so gosh darn fast. Of course, Manectric's another one of our problematic matchups. Anybody that's electric like that, and Mega Manectric itself is pretty common. Mega Manectric, of course, one-shots everything while setting up, so that's problematic for us. Flare tools are still kind of running around, so that's difficult. And one type of deck that's been really problematic are the combo decks that have been popularized over the last couple of weeks, like Flareon due to the St. Louis Regional, and the Executor decks kind of running around just a little bit. Those decks can be very difficult for this deck to overcome. It leads to a lot of long matches, which leads to kind of your degrading skill over time, so it makes long tournaments where you're going to play 9-10 rounds very challenging for you. Your neutral matchups are pretty good though, so that's definitely a point in favor of this deck. Overall, I'd say your matchups are really kind of like, I want to give us more credit, but to be completely honest, 3. You don't have a lot of really good, great matchups right now, really. I guess you could argue that Metal is probably your best matchup, but even then, they can end up kind of just stomping you. They can just get the Dialga up and just start stepping on you, so it can still be a really, I would count that almost more as a neutral matchup, truth be told. But anyway, so that brings us to our overall power for this deck, which is actually where this deck kind of shines the most, because it can take on almost anybody. Even the dreaded fairies, you can take them on despite their resistance, because you can still two-shot pretty much anything, and that's nice. It's nice the kind of power you have with Yveltal, taking on decks that play a more straightforward match. So you got a lot of good, I think almost any game is winnable. There are very few like auto-loss kind of situations, which is really nice. And you got a lot of power, and any deck that gives you a lot of options is always good, because it kind of keeps the door open to ways to win, even when things kind of go pear-shaped, which is really nice, and it makes the deck kind of reliable. Now, for a lot of people, this might be kind of a problem, that the deck is a little more complex to play, that it can demand you make the right plays, the right attachments, play the right items. Those spreads can be very dependent upon what particular Pokemon you run and how many of them you run to really be successful with this deck. That said, I really enjoy decks like that, and I thrive on that. That's part of why I play games. I like the games that really crack your brain, and you sit there and you're just like, man, good game at the very end of the match. Those are the games I live for. So, to me, that's actually a plus. Overall, I gotta say the deck is a very solid 4. While it's certainly not, the unparalleled Tier 1 Wrecking Ball or anything like that, this deck's probably descended to Tier 1.5, probably. You could still argue it's Tier 1, but I'd say it's kind of dropped a little bit in the last couple of weeks, playtesting around online. But, it's a very solid 4. And that's part of what made me want to play this deck, and Yveltal is pretty straightforward. While his support isn't always... some games you just win by beating people to death with Yveltal EX, and that's good enough for me. That's great. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to run this deck, though, because I got another deck that seems to be performing even better. And I'm going to show you that deck in the next day or two before we actually head off to States. So until then, like, comment, subscribe, and check out my channel for more Pokemon content.